Kian a human smuggler known for his devil-may-care attitude, had seen plenty of odd things across the galaxy, but nothing quite like the scene unfolding before him. Amidst the burning sands of Zico's prime, a stunning alien woman knelt beside two massive creatures, their blue fur shimmering in the unforgiving sunlight. Her golden hair sparkled, but her face was painted with desperation as she tried to comfort her fading companions. Kian had come here for a quick cargo drop, not to be a hero, but something in the intensity of her bright blue eyes made him pause. Against his better judgment, he moved closer. "Need some help?" he called out, flashing a grin. The woman looked up, startled. Tears glistened in her eyes, catching the light. "My companions, they're dying," she said softly, her voice like a melody. "They need water." Kian glanced at the creatures, which resembled oversized blue tigers with shimmering fur. Their tongues lolled out, panting heavily under the blazing sun. His own water supply was dangerously low, but leaving them to suffer didn't sit right with him. Sighing, he unclipped his canteen and handed it to her. "This is all I've got, but use it wisely." The alien's fingers brushed his as she took the canteen, sending an unexpected shiver through him. She carefully poured the precious water into the mouths of the two creatures, who eagerly lapped it up. Kian couldn't help but notice how striking she was, her skin a soft shade of sky blue, her pointed ears just visible beneath her golden locks. She was unlike anyone he had ever encountered before. Once the creatures, now more alert and less labored in their breathing, were revived, she turned to him with a look of deep gratitude. "I am Elyra of the Andari," she said. "These are my dear companions, Vex and Tasha. I can never repay your kindness." The tigers, their sapphire eyes now filled with curiosity rather than exhaustion, approached Kian. One, Vex, nuzzled his hand, and he tentatively reached out to stroke the creature's fur, marveling at how soft and otherworldly it felt. "Kian Drace," he introduced himself, still focused on petting Vex. "What brings you to a hellhole like Zico's prime?" Her face darkened. "We crashed here 2 rotations ago. My ship is beyond repair, and we've been stranded ever since. My companions, they're not used to such harsh conditions. On Anaria, water is abundant. But here," Kian frowned. He had no reason to stick around. He had his own ship nearby, his own problems to deal with. But abandoning her and her pets didn't feel right. "I've got a ship," he found himself saying. "I can give you a ride to the nearest port. Maybe even find some more water for your friends along the way." Elyra's eyes widened in surprise. "You do that? But you don't even know me." Kian shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Let's just say I've got a soft spot for damsels in distress, especially the blue-skinned, golden-haired type." A faint blush colored her cheeks, making her even more captivating. "Thank you," she whispered. "Your kindness will never be forgotten." As they began the long trek back to his ship, the Stellar Hawk, Kian couldn't help but feel his life had taken a complicated turn. But as he glanced at Elyra walking beside her majestic companions, he knew he had made the right decision. The sun beat down relentlessly, but Kian barely noticed the heat. His mind was occupied with thoughts of the mysterious woman beside him. She carried herself with a grace and nobility that belied her ragged appearance and their dire situation. Vex and Tasha flanked her, their powerful forms moving with quiet vigilance, scanning the dunes for any threats. When the battered silhouette of the Stellar Hawk finally appeared in the distance, Kian felt a sudden pang of doubt. He wasn't used to having passengers, especially not ones like Elyra. But when she turned to him, her eyes full of gratitude and a warmth he couldn't quite explain, his doubts faded. "She's not much to look at," Kian said as they approached his ship, "but she'll get us where we need to go." Elyra tilted her head, studying the freighter with a quiet intensity. "She looks perfect to me." A strange warmth bloomed in Kian's chest at her words. He keyed in the access code, and the ship's ramp lowered with a hiss. "Welcome aboard," he said, gesturing for her and her companions to enter. As the Stellar Hawk lifted off into the starlit expanse, Kian found himself drawn to Elyra's company. Over the following days, they spent countless hours in the cockpit, swapping stories about their lives. Elyra spoke of Anaria, a lush, green world where water flowed like rivers of glass and the people lived in harmony with nature. She described the crystal palaces of her home and the serene lakes where Vex and Tasha once swam. In return, Kian shared tales of his smuggling days, his close calls, and wild heists. He hadn't opened up to anyone like this in years, not since the painful memories of his past had caused him to bury his hopes and dreams. As time passed, Kian realized his feelings for Elyra had deepened. What had started as mere attraction had blossomed into something more, something he couldn't quite define. But there was always a shadow over their growing bond. Elyra had been evasive about why she was out here, what had brought her to Zico's prime. One night, Kian finally decided to ask. "Elyra," he said softly, "there's something you're not telling me. I can see it in your eyes." She stiffened, her gaze dropping. "I'm not just Elyra of the Andari," she confessed. "I'm Princess Elyra, and I'm running from a fate worse than death." Kian listened as she explained how she had been promised in marriage to a ruthless warlord, Dex Vorn, in a political arrangement that would have destroyed her spirit. Fleeing with Vex and Tasha, she had been hunted ever since. Kian's heart tightened. He didn't care that she was royalty. What mattered was keeping her safe. "You're not alone in this," he said firmly. "I'm not letting anyone take you, or your pets." Just as the weight of her story hung between them, the ship's proximity alarm screamed to life. Kian's blood ran cold as a massive warship appeared on the view screen. The mark of Dex Vorn emblazoned on its side. "They found us," Elyra whispered, her face pale. Vex and Tasha growled low, ready to defend their mistress. Kian gripped the controls, his jaw set. "Hold on. This is going to get rough." Kian's fingers flew over the controls of the Stellar Hawk as the proximity alarm wailed in the cockpit. Elyra, still pale, strapped herself into the co-pilot's seat. Her sapphire eyes were wide with fear, but a fierce determination burned beneath the surface. Vex and Tasha growled protectively at her feet, their sleek blue forms tense, ready to spring into action. The massive warship bearing the crimson insignia of Dex Vorn loomed behind them, bristling with weapons. Kian's heart pounded in his chest as the reality of the situation sank in. They were outgunned, outmatched, and running out of time. "You've faced worse," he muttered under his breath, forcing himself to stay calm. But the weight of the situation was heavy. Elyra's life, the lives of her beloved pets, and his own survival rested on his next move. "Strap in tight," he ordered, not taking his eyes off the warship closing in on them. "I'm about to try something reckless." Elyra didn't argue. Her grip on the armrests tightened, her eyes flicking to the looming shadow of Vorn's warship on the view screen. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear he could see flickering in her eyes. "Plan?" Kian shot her a quick, lopsided grin. "I thought we'd improvise." Before Elyra could respond, Kian yanked hard on the controls, sending the Stellar Hawk into a sharp dive. The ship groaned in protest, but the move had its desired effect. Vorn's warship, too large and unwieldy to match Kian's sudden maneuver, overshot them slightly. For a brief moment, they had some breathing room. Laser fire erupted from the warship, streaking past the Hawk. Kian grit his teeth, pulling the ship into a tight spiral to evade the barrage. The Stellar Hawk was nimble, but it wasn't built for extended combat. If they didn't find cover soon, they were finished. "See that asteroid field up ahead?" Kian nodded toward the swirling mass of jagged rocks on the view screen. "We're going in?" Elyra's eyes widened. "Through that? Are you crazy?" Kian gave a grim smile. "Maybe, but it's our best shot. That warship won't be able to follow us through there without tearing itself apart." Elyra glanced at the asteroid field, her jaw tightening. "Then do it. I trust you." Those words hit Kian harder than he expected. He hadn't felt trust from anyone in years, let alone from someone like her. Someone so regal, so unbroken despite everything she had faced. He couldn't let her down. With a flick of a switch, Kian engaged the afterburners, sending the Stellar Hawk rocketing toward the asteroid field. Behind them, Dex Vorn's warship loomed closer, its weapons lighting up the dark expanse of space. Kian dodged and weaved, narrowly avoiding another volley of laser fire. The moment they entered the asteroid field, everything became a blur of motion. Massive rocks, spinning and colliding with each other, filled the view screen. Kian's hands moved with practiced precision as he guided the ship through the dangerous labyrinth. One wrong move, and they'd be pulverized. "Hang on!" Kian shouted, pulling the Hawk into a tight roll as a massive chunk of rock hurtled toward them. The ship's shields flickered, barely holding as they scraped past the asteroid's edge. Behind them, Vorn's warship hesitated at the edge of the field, its larger size making it too risky to follow. Kian allowed himself a small smirk of satisfaction. They had made it for now. As the Hawk navigated deeper into the field, the tension in the cockpit eased slightly. Kian kept his focus sharp, dodging the smaller asteroids still whipping past them. Elyra sat silently beside him, her breathing steady but her posture rigid. Finally, after what felt like hours, Kian spotted a small, hidden alcove within the asteroid field. It was just large enough to park the Stellar Hawk and wait out any lingering threats. "Here," Kian said, guiding the ship into the alcove. The Stellar Hawk settled gently onto the rocky surface, the engines powering down with a soft hum. Kian exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "We're safe for now." Elyra unclipped her harness, her expression unreadable as she stood and moved toward the viewport. Vex and Tasha padded silently after her, their sapphire eyes scanning the rocky terrain outside. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice soft in the stillness of the ship. "For everything." Kian rose from his seat, stretching the tension out of his muscles. He moved to stand beside her, his gaze following hers out into the asteroid field. The warship was nowhere in sight, and for the first time since they'd fled Zico's prime, it felt like they had a moment to breathe. "You're welcome," he replied, his voice low. "But we're not out of the woods yet." Vorn's not the kind to give up easily. Elyra turned to him, her expression conflicted. "I know," she said, "and that's why I need to tell you something." Kian frowned, crossing his arms. "I'm listening." She took a deep breath, her gaze steady as she faced him. "It's not just that I'm running from Dex Vorn. There's something more, something I didn't tell you before." Kian's brow furrowed. "What is it?" Elyra hesitated, as if weighing whether to trust him with this final secret. But after everything they had been through, she knew she couldn't hide it any longer. "There's a reason Vorn wants me so badly," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just about the political alliance. He wants the power that comes with Anaria." Kian's eyes narrowed. "Power? What kind of power?" Elyra's gaze flickered toward Vex and Tasha, who sat silently at her side, their glowing blue eyes fixed on Kian. "The Andari people have a connection to our world, to the life force that sustains it. That connection is strongest in my bloodline, the royal family. Vorn believes that if he controls me, he can harness that power and use it to conquer the galaxy." Kian's heart sank as the full weight of her words hit him. This wasn't just about survival or escape. Elyra wasn't just a fugitive princess. She was the key to a far greater conflict, one that could tip the balance of power in the galaxy. "You're telling me," Kian said slowly, "that Vorn wants to use you as some kind of weapons?" Elyra nodded, her expression grim. "And he won't stop until he gets what he wants." Kian felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "Over my dead body." Elyra's eyes softened, and for a moment, the weight of the galaxy lifted as their gazes locked. "I hope it doesn't come to that," she whispered, a trace of sadness in her voice. "But I'm not going to let him take me. Not again." Kian clenched his fists. He didn't know how they were going to stop Dex Vorn, or what lay ahead. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let Elyra face this alone. "I've got your back," Kian said firmly, his voice filled with resolve. "No matter what." As the Stellar Hawk sat hidden in the heart of the asteroid field, Kian knew they were far from safe. But with Elyra by his side, and Vex and Tasha standing guard, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Together, they would find a way to survive. And together, they would fight. Kian sat in the pilot's chair, staring at the dark void outside the Stellar Hawk's viewport. The silence of the asteroid field surrounded them, heavy and unnerving. Elyra was resting in the small quarters behind him, her breathing soft and steady. Vex and Tasha, her ever-vigilant companions, were curled at her feet. He couldn't sleep. Not now. His mind raced with thoughts of what Elyra had revealed. The Andari power, the life force of an entire world, flowed through her veins. Dex Vorn wasn't just after a princess or a trophy bride. He wanted to control the essence of life itself, to weaponize Elyra's connection to her homeworld and use it to dominate the galaxy. Kian rubbed a hand over his face. He was a smuggler, a rogue with no ties to anyone or anything. Yet, here he was caught in the middle of a galactic power struggle, protecting a woman whose importance outweighed anything he'd ever been involved with. As he stared into the vastness of space, the proximity sensors blinked. A soft beep echoed in the cockpit, pulling him from his thoughts. His heart raced as his eyes darted to the console. At first, he feared it might be Vorn's warship, back to finish the job. But the signal wasn't coming from outside the asteroid field. It was coming from the asteroid itself. Kian's brow furrowed in confusion. He stood, his boots clanking softly against the metal floor, and walked to the scanner. The signal was faint but steady, coming from deep within the asteroid they had taken refuge on. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. It wasn't a distress signal, nor did it appear to be a natural energy source. It was something else, something hidden. A small frown tugged at his lips. This asteroid had been his hideout for years. He had stashed supplies here during his smuggling runs, used it as a safe haven when the galaxy's authorities were breathing down his neck. But he'd never encountered anything like this before. He considered waking Elyra, but decided against it. She needed rest. The last few days had been brutal on her, and after everything she'd been through, she deserved some peace, however fleeting it might be. Instead, he grabbed his blaster from its holster, clipped it to his belt, and moved toward the exit ramp. Stepping outside the Hawk, the eerie silence of the asteroid field greeted him once more. His boots crunched on the dusty surface as he followed the scanner's readings, leading him deeper into the rocky landscape. He kept his hand close to his blaster, his senses on high alert. If this was some kind of trap or a hidden threat, he wasn't about to be caught off guard. After a few minutes of walking, Kian came to the edge of a small ravine. The scanner's readings spiked. Below him, buried in the shadows, was the source of the signal. He descended carefully, keeping his eyes and ears open for anything out of place. When he reached the bottom, he spotted it, a metallic structure half buried beneath the asteroid's surface. It was ancient, covered in rust and debris, but unmistakably artificial. "What are you?" he murmured, crouching down to inspect it. His fingers brushed against the surface, feeling the cold, smooth metal. It was some kind of door or hatch long forgotten by time, and it was still active. Kian's mind raced. This wasn't just an abandoned mining facility. Something else had been here long before him, long before anyone had thought to use this asteroid as a hideout. And whatever it was, it had left something behind. He reached for his communicator, tapping it twice. "Elyra, you awake?" he said quietly. A few seconds passed before her soft voice crackled through. "Kian, is everything all right?" "I found something," he replied, glancing back at the strange structure. Deep inside the asteroid. "It's old, but it's giving off a signal. Thought you might want to take a look." There was a brief silence, followed by the sound of movement on the other end. "I'll be there in a minute." True to her word, Elyra arrived moments later, her elegant form moving gracefully across the rocky terrain. Vex and Tasha were at her side, their glowing eyes watching the surroundings warily. Kian couldn't help but smile as she approached. Even after everything they'd been through, she carried herself with a quiet strength that never ceased to amaze him. She knelt beside him, her gaze sweeping over the metallic structure. "This doesn't look like any mining equipment," she murmured, brushing away some of the dust. "It's far too advanced." Kian nodded. "That's what I thought. I'm guessing whatever this is, it's been here a long time. Longer than any of the smugglers or miners who've come through here." Elyra pressed her hand to the surface, her eyes narrowing in concentration. "There's something familiar about this energy signature," she said softly. "It feels alive." Kian frowned. "Alive? How?" "I don't know," Elyra admitted. pulling back slightly. But it's resonating with something inside me. I can feel it. She glanced at him, her sapphire eyes filled with uncertainty. I think it's Andari in origin. Kian's breath caught. If this was connected to Elyra's people, then they had stumbled upon something far more valuable than he'd realized. What do you think it is? He asked. She shook her head. I'm not sure, but we need to open it. Kian's gaze flickered to the hatch. If this was Andari technology, then opening it could be dangerous, or it could provide them with answers. Either way, there was no turning back now. All right, he said, standing and dusting off his hands. Let's see what secrets this thing is hiding. Elyra moved to the side of the hatch, her fingers tracing the outline of a small panel. Her touch was light, deliberate. With a quiet hum, the panel lit up, revealing a series of intricate symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. I recognize these, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. It's an old Andari code, used by my ancestors. Kian's heart raced. Elyra was unlocking something ancient, something long forgotten. He watched as her slender fingers moved deftly over the symbols, her concentration absolute. After a few tense moments, the hatch shuddered and began to open with a soft hiss. A cold breeze rushed out from within, carrying with it the scent of ancient air, untouched for centuries. What the hell? Kian muttered as he peered inside. Beyond the hatch lay a dark chamber, its walls lined with strange, glowing crystals that pulsed with an otherworldly light. In the center of the room, suspended in a column of energy, was a single object, a small, shimmering orb that seemed to vibrate with power. Elyra stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat. Her voice trembled. That's an Andari heartstone. Kian blinked. And what? A heartstone, Elyra repeated, her voice barely audible. It's the core of our planet's energy. Only a few exist, and they're guarded fiercely by the Andari people. If Vorn knew this was here, Kian's stomach dropped. The heartstone was more than just a relic. It was a source of unimaginable power, and now they were standing right in front of it. What do we do? He asked, his voice tight with unease. Elyra's gaze never left the glowing orb. We have to protect it, she whispered. At all costs. Suddenly, the communicator on Kian's belt crackled to life. A deep, cold voice echoed through the device, sending a chill down his spine. You can't hide forever, princess. It was Dex Vorn. Kian's hand instinctively went to his blaster as Elyra's face drained of color. They had been found. Vorn was coming for them, and for the heartstone. The cold, menacing voice of Dex Vorn echoed through the cavernous chamber, sending a jolt of fear through Kian and Elyra. The glowing heartstone pulsed softly in the center of the room, its radiant energy casting long shadows across their faces. Elyra's breath hitched, her sapphire eyes wide with fear. They've found us, she whispered, her voice trembling. Kian gripped his blaster tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no more time to think, no more time to plan. Vorn was here, and they were out of options. We'll have to make our stand, Kian said, his voice grim. He scanned the room, his mind racing. They were deep inside the asteroid, surrounded by walls of solid rock, with only one way in or out. The advantage was slim, but it was all they had. We have to hold this place. We can't let him get the heartstone. Elyra nodded, though her expression was filled with doubt. Vex and Tasha, her blue-furred companions, moved to her side, their glowing eyes alert, ready to defend her. Kian could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. It wasn't just their lives at stake. It was the fate of Elyra's people, the Andari, and the balance of power in the galaxy itself. Footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Kian's blood turned to ice as he realized how close they were. Elyra, get back, he ordered, positioning himself near the entrance. He aimed his blaster at the narrow opening of the cave, his pulse steadying as his smuggler instincts kicked in. Stay with Vex and Tasha. If this goes south, you take the heartstone and run. Understand? Kian, I'm not leaving you. Do it, he snapped, turning to face her. This isn't just about us anymore. If Vorn gets his hands on that heartstone, it's over. For you, for me, For Elyra. You have to be ready. Elyra bit her lip, her eyes filled with worry, but she nodded. She knew there was no arguing with him now. Her slender fingers wrapped around the shimmering heartstone as she took a step back, Vex and Tasha flanking her protectively. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. The oppressive weight of the stillness made Kian's skin crawl, his blaster aimed and ready for whatever came next. Then, the darkness at the entrance of the chamber shifted. A tall, hulking figure stepped into the dim light. A man wrapped in dark armor, his crimson insignia blazing on his chest. Dex Vorn. His icy blue eyes locked onto Kian's, and a sinister smile twisted his lips. You really thought you could hide from me? Vorn's voice was deep, dripping with malice. I always get what I want. Kian didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger of his blaster, unleashing a volley of fire toward Vorn. But the warlord was faster than he appeared. With a flick of his wrist, Vorn activated a glowing energy shield that absorbed the shots effortlessly, the blast fizzling out against the shimmering barrier. Kian cursed under his breath, ducking behind a rock formation for cover. Vorn's heavy boots echoed through the chamber as he advanced, his eyes gleaming with victory. This doesn't have to be difficult, Vorn taunted, his voice echoing against the cavern walls. Hand over the girl and the heartstone, and I might let you live. You played your little game, smuggler, but it's time to face reality. You're outmatched. Kian peeked out from behind the rock, his mind racing. He was running out of options. He fired again, aiming for a weak spot in Vorn's armor, but the warlord deflected the shots with ease, his shield shimmering with every impact. You're wasting your time, Vorn growled, his patience wearing thin. He lifted his hand, and a burst of energy erupted from his palm, slamming into the rocks behind Kian. The force of the blast sent him sprawling, his blaster clattering across the ground. Kian, Elyra cried out, starting to move toward him. Stay back! Kian shouted, scrambling to his feet. He could feel the bruises forming on his ribs, but he couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not with everything on the line. Vorn's cold gaze shifted to Elyra. Princess, he said with a mocking bow, his voice dripping with malice. You've caused me quite a bit of trouble, but it ends here. Hand over the heartstone, and I'll make your death swift. Elyra's eyes blazed with defiance, her grip tightening around the heartstone. I'd rather die than let you take this, she spat. Vorn's smile widened. So be it. He raised his arm, preparing to strike, but before he could, a loud growl tore through the chamber. Vex and Tasha leapt forward, their fangs bared, their blue fur bristling with energy. They lunged at Vorn, teeth and claws flashing, but the warlord was ready. With a brutal backhand, he sent Vex crashing into the wall, the creature letting out a pained yelp. Tasha snarled, her jaws snapping at Vorn's armored leg, but he kicked her away with a vicious blow. Kian's heart raced. This was it. They couldn't hold out much longer. And then, an idea sparked in his mind. He glanced at the heartstone in Elyra's hands. The ancient Anduri power pulsed within it, a source of immense energy. If Vorn wanted it so badly, then maybe it could be used against him. Elyra, Kian called out, his voice sharp. The heartstone, use it. She hesitated, her eyes wide. I don't know how. You have to, Kian shouted. It's the only way. Elyra looked down at the heartstone, her fingers trembling. She could feel its power coursing through her, an ancient energy she had barely begun to understand. But there was no time to think, no time to doubt. With a deep breath, she closed her eyes and focused. The heartstone began to glow brighter, its light intensifying as Elyra tapped into its core. Her body trembled as the energy surged through her, flooding her veins with raw, untamed power. Vorn noticed the change immediately. His eyes narrowed, and he lunged toward her, his hands reaching for the heartstone. But it was too late. A blinding burst of light exploded from the heartstone, engulfing the chamber in a brilliant, shimmering wave. Vorn screamed as the energy slammed into him, his body convulsing with pain. The power of Elyra surged through him, tearing at his very essence. Kian shielded his eyes as the light grew brighter, hotter, until it filled every corner of the cavern. The sound of Vorn's screams echoed in his ears, growing fainter with each passing second. And then silence. When Kian opened his eyes, the chamber was still. Vorn's body lay motionless on the ground, his armor cracked and smoldering. The crimson insignia on his chest was scorched, the mark of his reign of terror destroyed. Elyra stood in the center of the room, the heartstone dimming in her hands. She swayed on her feet, her energy spent, but she was alive. Vex and Tasha limped to her side, both battered but breathing. Kian rushed to her, his heart pounding. "Elyra, are you?" "I'm all right," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She looked down at the heartstone, its once brilliant light now reduced to a faint glow. "It's over." Kian pulled her into his arms, relief flooding through him. "You did it," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us." She looked up at him, her sapphire eyes shining with exhaustion and something deeper, a quiet strength that had been forged in the fires of battle. "We saved each other," she said softly. As they stood there, surrounded by the remnants of their struggle, Kian knew that their journey wasn't over. There were still battles to be fought, still dangers lurking in the shadows. But for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had faced the darkness and come out the other side. Together, and whatever the future held, Kian knew one thing for certain. He would never let her face it alone.